Hi everyone, welcome back to my read-along of A Tale of Stars and Shadow. I'm thrilled to have you here. We're up to chapter 25 today. Let's jump straight into it. Okay. Narvis entered the apartment soundlessly as always, dressed simply, manner deliberately innocuous so that any eyes falling onto him would simply pass by without question. It was exactly the same thing the Shadowhawk did, and for similar reasons. He worked alone and his entire livelihood relied on not being noticed. It's been months, Narvis, he snapped, annoyed by his calm facade and trying to push him into some sort of reaction. I asked you to get information on her and you don't work for you, Narvis replied smoothly. I bring you information when and if I get it. That's how it works. Suspicion rose in a hot tide. He needed Narvis's information, relied on it to do the work he did. But there was always the underlying unease that only grew with every encounter they had. Narvis knew too much, could undo him with a single word to the city patrol or the wingguard. Maybe it would be better to cut ties completely, go it entirely on his own. As if sensing his thoughts, Narvis came straight out with the information he'd brought. Talon Dynan is Columnian-born and you've told me that already. She's a warrior. Narvis kept talking through the interruption. Joined the Aimsier at an unusually young age, then went to Callanan Tower at an equally unusual young age. By most accounts, she was the best of her class. They sent their best, Shadowhawk. That confirmed everything he'd learned from their brief meeting. She hadn't been bragging, and he'd been a fool to keep acting the way he always had since her arrival, and not expect her to catch him. There's more though, Narvis. I can feel it. A test. Did he know she was royal? Were his sources that good? And if he did, would Narvis tell him? The quality of the informant's silence was odd, like maybe he was surprised. No, that wasn't it. Agreement, maybe? When he spoke, the Shadowhawk sensed frustration. From what I could gather, there is some confusion about why she joined the Kingshield. She was too good, too successful to leave the Callanan. I couldn't learn any more than that. The Callanan and Kingshield both are incredibly protective of their own. They don't talk to outsiders. Do the Queen or her sons know everything you just told me about her? As far as I can tell, no. They asked for a king's shield, but didn't seem to have taken much particular interest in the one that was sent. The frustration in the man's voice deepened. The Shadowhawk shook his head. And the break-in at the Citadel? You know the Wingguard are blaming me for that. I've asked around my network, but it wasn't any of them. I'm sure of it. I have nothing to tell you on that. The suspicion was back. You're an information peddler, Narvis, yet you have no information on such unusual events? Not yet, I don't. Firm grey eyes lifted to meet his. He must have seen something in the Shadowhawk's face because he looked around suddenly. You're in a new location. Why? She found me. Who? A hint of panic filled the informant's voice, and the Shadowhawk frowned. What had caused sudden emotion out of the deliberately opaque informant? The Kingshield. And she let you go? He barked out a laugh. Such a high opinion you have of my self-preservation skills, Narvis. I told you what she was. If she found you once, she can do it again. All it takes is her talking to the Falcon, and you're done. But she didn't, and I'm not without leverage of my own. She understands that I can get to her too, he mused, thinking, and it gave me the opportunity to learn about her. If there's an ulterior motive in her posting, she doesn't seem aware of it. She seemed very focused on her job to protect the prince. The upcoming Alea match bears that out, Narvis said with a shrug, his equanimity seemingly restored. If she were aligned with Mithanas in any way, he would never have set her up to fail so miserably. He started pacing again. The only one with power to act in Mithrana outside Mithanas is the Queen. She either requested the King's Shield or approved Ravenia requesting it. You have an interestingly thorough understanding of the Winged Folk Society, Narvis said, ignoring the Shadowhawk's sudden stiffening. I agree, but the question then becomes why is she acting now, and without Mithanas' approval? Montan continues to breathe down her neck, the Shadowhawk considered. Maybe she thinks having an official liaison from the Twin Thrones might help keep them at a distance. By suggesting a stronger alliance than actually exists? Narvis sounded sceptical. There are more compelling reasons Montan would think twice before attempting to take Mithrana, not the least of which is that Mithanas is the most likely to become the chosen heir. His Montani blood makes him one of their own, and his magic is a powerful deterrent, which is why undermining his future rule isn't necessarily the best idea. Anger flared, hot and bright, making him snarl. So we all just stand by and let his family continue to treat the humans like cattle in a penned yard? The silence that followed his outburst was patient, like the man knew it was guilt and doubt that had made him lash out, not anger directed at him. When Narvis spoke again, it was to change the subject. "I have something else for you, too." "What is it?" "Payment first," Narvis said evenly. The Shadowhawk drew the bag from his tunic and passed the man a single gold coin. Narvis took it. "There's a shipment of flour arriving in 2 days. The Wingguard plan to use it to ambush you. I think that earns me a second gold piece." He gave a sharp nod and passed Narvis a second coin before tucking the bag securely back inside his tunic. If the flour was needed, there would be other ways of going about it, but Narvis's warning would keep him and his network members from getting caught. He needed to be more careful now. When the door closed behind Narvis, the Shadowhawk continued pacing. Deep weariness flooded him, a bone tiredness that warned he needed sleep or there would be consequences. And he couldn't afford to get so tired that he couldn't. He swore and slumped into a chair. There were so many possibilities, and he didn't know which was the right way to turn. There was nobody he could trust. His thoughts snagged on Narvis's reference to the Alea game. Humans couldn't match the athleticism of the winged folk or their magic. The wolves would be utterly humiliated, and then it would all be over. As a laughingstock, they could never be a serious protection detail. Abruptly, he sat up straight. Could that be the true purpose? Leave Kieran humiliated and without proper protection? A counter-move against the Queen, or whoever had requested the King's shield? The captain's face floated into his mind, and he closed his eyes. She seemed strong, fair, and dedicated to her task. But she'd found him so easily, and something told him she hadn't just done that to find out what he had to do with the break-in at the palace. The way she'd studied him and his surroundings, her careful questions. And then there was Zamaral, who was certain she wasn't just here as a King's shield liaison. The thief had solid instincts. If she betrayed him to the Falcon or the city patrol, he would die. There was no doubt about that. But she hadn't. Whatever her reasons were, right now they didn't include him being caught. And whatever her purpose, it didn't include caring about the wider concerns of humans in Mithrena. There was little she could or would do to help him. Steeling himself, he rose from his chair and moved towards the doorway. Midnight was rapidly approaching. He had things to do, and already he'd been away too long. Midnight had come and gone, but the rundown bar in the poor quarter was full of patrons. The Shadowhawk leaned at the corner of the long bar, sipping at a half-full glass of watery ale. Sticky rings marked the dark wooden surface, left by a substance he was very careful not to touch or wonder too much about. He was already breathing through his mouth at the urine-edged scent of ale hovering like a cloud in the humid air. He'd only come to leave a request for Sneer to meet, making a white chalk mark under the edge of the far end of the bar. But leaving as soon as he'd arrived would look odd in a place like this, so he'd lingered, sipping at his ale and hiding his impatience to be gone. Even that was difficult. Weariness weighed down every inch of him. The anxious tug in his gut, he needed to be elsewhere, had already been gone too long. Didn't help. He'd almost finished his ale when that whisper brushed over him again. The inn was loud, the poor acoustics making the hum of conversation close to deafening, yet it had been clear as day. Just like the night he'd found that body. He frowned, trying to isolate the feeling. It wasn't dissimilar to the sensation of drawing the shadows around himself, an instinctive ability he'd had since childhood. Not once had he ever come across anyone else who could do it, not even amongst the best of the thieves and criminals in the city. Maybe that had changed. It whispered across his senses again, an edginess carrying a hint of darkness, both warning and threat. His head came up, scanning the room in a quick glance. There wasn't much light, only what was cast by a handful of lanterns hanging from the cracked and unpainted walls. It showed people packed wall to wall, most drinking, all talking. Few were on their own like him. The whisper brushed over him again, and his hand reached for the knife concealed at his back of its own accord. A low hiss sounded through the room, cut through the noisy chatter. Then another hiss, from a different part of the room. A flash of copper. The Shadowhawk began to push through the crowd towards it. Unnamed disquiet filled him. Another flash of copper, a mask, just like the one he'd seen that night. His hand curled around the cool hilt of his blade. He never used the knife. It was a last resort only, but the sheer weight of the danger in the room made it impossible not to reach for the reassurance of a weapon. A warning thrummed at the back of his mind, urging him to get out now, to walk away and not look back. It told him he was walking into something deadly. But he'd never been able to walk away. A scream cut over the noise then. It was followed quickly by a shout of mingled shock and anger. People began crowding around an area in the corner of the room, while others pushed their way towards the exits. The Shadowhawk was shoved from all directions as he kept trying to get to where he'd seen the mask. A man brushed by him, sending all his senses screaming into awareness. Nondescript clothing, tall, wiry, and wearing a copper mask that covered the top half of his face. The metal gleamed under the hood of a cloak pulled well down over his head. He turned, a hand half raised to grab him, but hesitation cost him, and the crowd of fleeing bodies closed around the masked man, quickly carrying him out of the Shadowhawk's reach. Cursing, he kept moving, pushing through the last line of patrons until reaching a cleared space on the filthy floorboards. A body lay there in a spreading pool of blood. Another man, well-dressed, clearly not a resident of the poor quarter. His throat had been slashed from ear to ear. A piece of torn-off parchment lay on his chest. Another marker. Vengeance. The inn was emptying out quickly now. The city patrol might even be called, especially since it looked like a wealthier human who'd been killed. Again, he hesitated. He wanted to take a closer look, but he wasn't wearing his mask tonight and he didn't want to stand out. Someone might remember the man who took an unusual interest in a dead body. Nor did he want to be here when the city patrol arrived. He had to leave. Spinning, he strode for the back exit, not realizing until he got to the door that his hand was still clenched, white-knuckled, around the hilt of the knife at his back. Forcing himself to let go, he tried to shake the residue of fear and threat by focusing on the details of what had happened. It hadn't been a single killer this time. He'd seen at least 2 masks working in tandem, and it hadn't been a random kill. This felt different, very different, from the killings he'd seen in Dock City before. Deaths weren't an uncommon occurrence when people were poor and lived in areas infested by competing criminal gangs. It was one of the reasons he did what he did, an often useless attempt to get enough food and basic supplies to people so they didn't need to rely on crime to survive. No, this felt targeted and specific, and no criminal gang he'd heard of left notes behind to mark their kills. Usually they just dumped bodies and left them there to be discovered, or not. Uneasiness trickled down his spine. Who wanted vengeance? And for what? Worse, if a new gang had formed to start a killing spree, it would draw even more attention from the city patrol into areas the Shadowhawk preferred they stay clear of. And if they couldn't handle the problem, the Falcons would get involved. He was already dealing with having to be extra careful after Talon Dynan had found him, and now this. It would make what he did even harder. At the very least, he'd have to curtail some of his activities, which meant less people he could help. Frustration boiled over, but once it was gone, there was only the bone-deep weariness he'd felt earlier. He had to get back. All right, that brings us to the end of chapter 25. If you'd like to avoid spoilers, then this is the point where you should jump out before I head into my author commentary. If you are jumping out here, thanks so much for sticking around. I hope you enjoyed that. And I look forward to seeing you in the next chapter, chapter 26. Otherwise, let's carry on and have a chat about this chapter. All right, chapter 25. So we get a fairly meaty Shadowhawk chapter here, which is a lot of fun. As kind of an overall comment from an author perspective, there are quite a few and slightly heavier references littered throughout this chapter as to Kewin's identity as the Shadowhawk. There are a number of references that he makes internally to the fact that he needs to be somewhere else, or he's at least very mindful that he's absent from somewhere. And obviously that's the fact that Prince Kewin has a life up at the Citadel in which he's expected to be at dinners and parties, and he's very cognizant of the fact that while he's running around as the Shadowhawk in Dock City, he's absent, and that people might be making note of that. So he really always, one layer of concern simmering away at the back of his mind is the fact that he needs to make sure that his absence is not marked or not too noticeable, and he needs to kind of get back to the Citadel and not spend too long absent where people might notice. And then there's a very direct reference to the fact that he has shadow magic. Now, Kewin doesn't know what that is. He's been born with it. It comes through his bloodline from his ancestors. That story that's been referenced before to Talon by the first shield in Calumnia, relating her the history of the Dinmarics. That story is written, Talon's ancestor, Kewin's ancestor. That will be published one day. But yeah, not yet. But that's where that magic comes from. Kewin doesn't know what it is, obviously, but it is the shadow magic that the shadow assassins of Firthland have, is the ability to wrap themselves in shadows and hide completely, which he comes to great effect for him as the Shadowhawk. And then again, there are multiple references if you're looking closely to him using song magic. So particularly in that conversation with Narvis at the beginning, Kuan, the Shadowhawk, is growing increasingly uneasy about Narvis. And it's not necessarily about anything that we can, as the reader can see on the surface there. Narvis appears to be doing his job. He's shifty, of course. That's part of the package of being an informant, working with criminals in the underbelly of the city. But he's showing up. He gives Kuan Shadowhawk information he needs in return for payment. He hasn't betrayed him, even though he could have. But Kuan's using his song magic to its fullest degree throughout any interaction with this man. He has to do that for his survival. And just reading, if you're reading very carefully between the lines there's something about Narvis that's making Kuan, over time, increasingly uncomfortable about continuing to work with him. Now, for those of you who have read the series, we all know that Narvis is actually Sarvan, Tarkos' agent in Mithrena, working toward Tarkos and Azralan's ultimate plan. Big spoiler alert there. So there's a good reason that Kuan is growing uneasy. He picks up something from Narvis that is, even though he doesn't necessarily know what it is, he knows it's not quite right. And then we have him going about his normal activities as the Shadowhawk, leaving a message for Sania, and then being a witness to another vengeance murder. This is something different. This is something outside his experience. It's not the usual kind of criminal, violent activity that happens in the Poor Quarter. These appear to be targeted murders of wealthy humans. There's the added theatre of the those undertaking the killers wearing the copper mask. It's all very unsettling for poor Shadowhawk, who's dealing with a Kaladin stalking him. He's dealing with increased interest from the Falcons and the City Patrol. And now this. And he feels responsible for all of it. So I've said this before, but this comes back to Kuan's Doomnoric's blood, that sense of responsibility for those that they rule, the fact that he feels like he's failing them because he's not doing enough. All these layers that Kuan and Shadowhawk is fighting with constantly. It makes him exhausted, understandably so. But yeah, so we get to the end of this chapter with the Shadowhawk feeling even more like this events might be spiraling outside his control a little bit, but still he keeps going and keeps trying because that's who he is. So yeah, if you have any questions or comments about this chapter, I'd love to hear them. Drop them in the comments below. Also consider liking and subscribing and hitting that little notification bell so you get notified when these videos drop. Every Wednesday morning, every Sunday morning, Australia time at 9 a.m. Can't wait to see you for chapter 26. So yeah, I'll see you then. Have a great day.